Hello and welcome to Across the Karman Line, a Vodcast X podcast series where we talk about all things space. I'm Aditya Varma and I'm here with my co-hosts Pratyaksha and Ellen. Today we have the remarkable Mr. Nicholas Booth. He's a writer and has written many books about space with topics ranging from planets to what we can expect from the next century in space. He also previously worked as a science creator at The Observer and a technology editor for The Times. He's recently written the book The Search for Life on Mars, the greatest scientific discovery of all time. Nicholas, we're excited to have you join us for our podcast series.
Thank you. I'm not going to give a hard sell for the book. I've just done that, but there we are. What I wanted to do was to give you a flavour of what I've done, and it's really how to have a career in the space industry without having a career in the space industry. As you can see from that first slide, that was me literally 40 years ago at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but I'll come back to that. Like a lot of you, I got started and interested because of astronomy, and there's me with a telescope, not a particularly good telescope, but I had a telescope when I was a teenager, and at that time, very little was known about the outer solar system, so that was really the reason for the Voyager missions that were launched. I came to London. I was in International Hall. I studied at Bedford College, which is the building there in Regent's Park. It's still there, but it's called something else, because in those days, all the little colleges were being merged with somewhere else. King's College had, I think, Queen Elizabeth College, and there was a small college in Chelsea that all got merged together. I spent most of my 3 years doing physics, not understanding a word. So if anybody here is watching this and is doing a degree and thinks, imposter syndrome, I don't understand any of that, you're not alone. Do not worry about that. All I can say in my favour there is, there's me with, at least I wore a t-shirt with an astronomical motif. I spent most of my last year in the cinema opposite International Hall where I stayed, not because I was just being idle, but I knew that I was only good enough to get a 2-2. I knew that if I, even if I stayed in and didn't go out, I knew what my limitations were. And sometimes that's one of the toughest things that you actually will learn as a student, that no matter how hard you work, you're never going to push through that barrier. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. But I do have a great interest in French films, and it started from going to that. If any of you are in International Hall, I'm delighted that these photos are still there in the basement. We were just messing about and doing stuff. And in fact, the two guys there, were the sound engineers, went on to the sound industry. They're both physics graduates of King's. So there are lots of other careers that you can do. Mainly we're just poncing about and doing that. Whenever people talk about physics and the lack of, particularly women, and lack of diversity, it's a complete mystery to me, because Bedford College had traditionally been a women's teaching college, and 12 of us, or roughly 12 of us, graduated, half of whom were females, and all the girls in this photo got firsts, and the other girl, who was Malaysian, she also got a first. So when people say there's very little, there aren't enough women or whatever going into physics, it's an utter mystery to me because of the college I went to. But what it shows is there's absolutely no limitation. Doesn't matter where you're from, what you look like, what you sound like, whatever you want to do. If you've got the ability to do it, you can go off and do great things. This photo was taken just a week before I graduated. I've always had strange hair. It's always looked like that. This is what, if I could go back in time and say to this guy, 3 weeks after graduating, piece of advice is two things. One is, don't worry. Two, the next 10 years will be the most fun you ever have. It doesn't matter what you do. Some of it won't be great, but a lot of it, it doesn't matter what you do, because you can afford to mess up. This was actually stuck on my door in International Hall, and somebody wrote, "You what?" And the word Kaliwa was an Indonesian restaurant, because the reason I know this is I have several claims to fame. My favourite one is being the chairman of the King's College Singaporean and Malaysian Society for one term. And I wasn't at King's, and I wasn't Singaporean or Malaysian. They just needed a name to put on it to send the bank statement. Unfortunately, there was only £13 in it, so I couldn't go away to the Bahamas. But there we go. So I have very fond memories of people in my hall of residence and coming to King's. Here's my claim to fame. When I was 16, you tell I wanted to be an engineer because I used to put too many pens in my pocket. I decided I wanted to go to JPL for the Voyager 2 encounter with Saturn. And I just wrote a series of letters, and by a series of bizarre accidents, they got answered, and I'll come to that. The point was in the space industry then, if if you stuck your head above the parapet and were sensible about it, and in those days, I was going to go, I said I was going to study physics, and then I could, go off and be a postgraduate and do all that sort of stuff. And the problem was that one of the reasons I got to sort of be in my bonnet about it, because the cupboard was bare. After 1981, there wasn't much the cupboard was empty, mainly because of the space shuttle. The space shuttle had eaten all of NASA's funds in those days. And we're coming up to the 40th anniversary of the first flight, which I can remember very, very plainly, because an hour before Columbia came back to Earth, the phone rang. I was in the garden, and my mum came out and said, "You've got a phone call from Washington." And I thought it was a practical joke, but it wasn't. It was one of my letters had landed on the desk of this guy, Dr. Al Hibbs at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he thought, this kid, he's showing a bit of willing here, so let's give him a summer job. And that's how I became the youngest Brit to have worked for JPL. Al had an extraordinary career, which I'll talk about a little bit. He was the voice of a lot of the space missions, and this was the Viking mission to Mars. And there's Tim Much, the camera expert, when they were waiting for the first picture from, and there it is, the first ever picture from the surface of Mars. Those rocks don't look too dissimilar from the most recent ones from Perseverance. So if you want to show a bit of willing and go off at a strange angle, there's nothing wrong with that, because people will take you, as long as you're being serious about it, people will take you seriously. Voyager had been launched. It was the first missions to the outer planets. Voyager 2 was coming up to Saturn. And after that, it was unclear whether there would be any more Voyager funding. The Reagan administration had come in. They'd locked back everything. They'd put most of NASA's budget into the shuttle. So one of the reasons I said, please give me a job, I want to come and see this, is because although the tanks were full and it could go on to Uranus and Neptune, it wasn't clear whether the US government would carry on funding it. It did, and I accidentally, going out there's the press room at the von Karman auditorium. There's me with another astronomical motif, sitting next to John Lomberg, who was one of Carl Sagan's artists for Cosmos. So I sort of accidentally was exposed to being a journalist at a time when I didn't want to be a journalist. So sometimes, again, with your career, you find yourself doing things or being exposed to things that you don't realize how important they are. Here's high-tech 1981, no social media, no YouTube, lots of pictures that were stuck to a wall. And here's a piece of career advice for some of you. So there am I with that same t-shirt. And this was a guy who was an up-and-coming guy at MIT, a radar specialist. And the only advice I can really give you about going into science is, if you decide to sell secrets to another government, make sure that the FBI isn't in the room. Because that guy Stuart knows that this happened to him recently. It's quite extraordinary to me to know that I knew him way back when. I got to know all the Voyager people. There's the project scientist in what was known as the Blue Room, having a cup of coffee. I sat in the press room and noticed there's no pictures there, because what happened was Voyager 2 flew behind of Saturn. By the time it came out, the camera platform had jammed. So they fixed it, because people always fix the problems. But it was extraordinary to be able to be there and be like a sort of cabin boy on a journey of exploration. That was the last day. That was a party. I don't know why I've got cake on my nose, but I've got cake on my nose. And really, I asked Aditya earlier about the rocket, building rockets, and you were banished up to Cambridge. Well, in the early days of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, these guys were banished from the Caltech campus because they kept blowing stuff up, and the academics said, go away, get thee to the Arroyo over in the distance, and that's where they built JPL. And they were building rockets. That's how they started. Now, one of the interesting things is that why they were taken seriously was because of this guy. I was intrigued to know this talk is a Karman lecture, because there's von Karman. He was a remarkable Hungarian-born scientist who went to the States in the 20s and really set up Caltech into the aeronautics business, because, as you know, aeronautics is very, very fancy mathematics. He was a Martian. There's a fantastic book, which if you've not read, if you don't read my book, absolutely fine, read this one. There are these handful of Hungarians were called Martians because of what I still think is one of probably the best jokes I've ever heard, which was they obviously couldn't pretend they were anything other than Hungarian because of their accent. So several people thought they actually might be Martians. There's also the great, which always makes me laugh whenever people's, because I saw this recently when people are pontificating about, are we alone in the cosmos? And, Fermi asked, where are they? And Leo Szilard, who was one of the Martians, said, they're among us, but they call themselves Hungarians, which I thought was quite funny. Here's a piece I did for The Observer, exactly 60 years to the day after an event happened where Szilard, and I can just quickly, if you walk up to the top of Southampton Road, just when it comes to Russell Square, because International Hall is just the other side there, there's a traffic light. And it was there that Szilard noticed the line of cars coming along and suddenly had this idea that they could be a series of neutrons. And that was how he got the basic idea. That's how you would create a nuclear atomic bomb. And really what I've been doing in all these years is not doing hard sums of mathematics, is coming up with stories about to try and explain to people. And, it's a different skill set, but it sort of manages to grasp people's attention. Here's why von Karman is famous, because of von Karman vortices, because of small little incremental changes in temperature and weather and what have you that have a different effect. And they're inherently unstable. He famously wrote a paper, The Engineer Grapples with Nonlinear Problems. And it didn't really catch on, because if he'd have called it what we call it today, chaos theory, people might think, oh, okay, I get that. The idea of a butterfly's wings flapping, causing a hurricane 2 weeks later in another country. That's one thing you learn from journalism is if you come up with a great theory, you've got to give it a good name for it to catch on. So, it might be a nonlinear problem, but if you call it chaos theory, it will grab people's attention. Caltech is famous because of pranks. I should point out there was no way I would have ever got in there under my own steam of sitting exams and trying to pass the exams, a bit like getting to King's, really. But there's a whole history of sort of poncing about, which is quite funny. They famously took over the Hollywood sign. That was 1987. Here's how to enliven a boring lecture. Just bring your pet cougar to work. And this sort of stuff went on the whole time. I wish we'd have thought of that when I was at Bedford. In 2013, as a younger man, still had dark hair, we went to JPL and they're being stalked by a rover. And what's quite funny is that kind of irreverence and subversion continues because NASA, which funds JPL, said, we're fed up of, JPL gets all the kudos, it's American government, we want NASA, we don't want any JPL logos anywhere on the Curiosity lander. So what they did was they put in the tread tracks of Curiosity, the Moors for JPL. So every time you see a Curiosity rover track, you can see that the word JPL is there. So next time you just do something like that with KCL, and people, at least you will know, and everybody else will then catch on. Just last week, the parachute for Perseverance, part of which was built in Devon, I believe. I'm not quite sure. I haven't really looked into it, but I do hope that when they do an analysis, they might find clotted cream or something on the surface of Mars. They did the same thing. They put in within the code their Dare Mighty Things, which is the JPL unofficial logo. And for all of you who want to go off and to do space, doing physics or whatever, that's what you do. Dare to be different and dare to do something different. Al Hibbs, his wife Marka, was there. They had a cat called Titan. He was called Titan not because he was the emperor of the gods, but he appeared the week that Voyager 1 flew past Saturn, and Titan, the moon, was the same colour as him in Marka's hair. One day that summer, she said to me, "Oh, Al's old supervisor's coming to, we're having a party," and there's a photo I took, and there's Marka, and there's her supervisor. And this is how I got to take a photograph of Richard Feynman in a swimming pool with a Vons bag. They didn't say, oh, the greatest theoretical physicist of the 20th century will be joining us later. That came later when I realized that who Feynman was. And there's absolutely no way I'd ever got to meet him as a student. My friend Marcus Chown, whose name you might recognize, he studied at Caltech and met Feynman a few times. So I can honestly say I got to meet him socially. Feynman is famous for many, many different reasons. The most obvious one was he was at Los Alamos. There he is sitting next to Oppenheimer. And Feynman was part of the theoretical division who realized in those days without computers and calculators, if you broke down all the little equations, all the big equations of little equations, you could solve nonlinear problems much faster. He clowned around. I mean, there he is when he was getting the Nobel Prize, which he always said he didn't particularly like, but it did give him the ability to, to clown around. He said the best thing about going to Sweden for the Nobel ceremony was the students gave him a party. So next time somebody at King's is a Nobel laureate, give them a party because they'll remember that more than anything else. He said many, many great quotes, and one that really struck with me, and one that I think I sort of instinctively brought to the party was this: if you can't explain something to a first year student, then you haven't really understood. And that is the key if you then decide you want to popularize what you're doing or write about it or talk about it. If you don't understand it, it's obvious. So you really need to understand what you're doing then to be able to explain it. Feynman and Hibbs wrote several papers which came about because of this. In fact, it's not the greatest photo to show. It was how the wind makes waves. Well, you can see there, it's Venice Beach. We're on holiday there. There's actually no wind. This is how there he is, Albert Hibbs, 1955, dissertation with Feynman. It's how a physicist who worked on probabilities ended up with a quantum theoretical physicist on a PhD about how the waves make wind, how the wind makes waves. In other words, they weren't expert in it, but by the time they finished, they were. And that's something else as you go forward in your career. It doesn't matter, you don't have to be an expert in it. As long as you bring your intelligence and your studies to what you're doing, you'll be able to do that. This is a sort of this is Durdle Door. What the reason for showing that is the wind adds the waves, and here is a very fine example of sinusoidal waves. And trying to understand that, there's lots of very complicated pieces. They got one or two, and now you use supercomputers to model that. But it started oceanographers on that journey. They hated writing. One day, a publisher's agent came into Feynman's office, said, "Would you write a book?" This was before he got the Nobel Prize. And they wrote this book about how to write path integrals for quantum mechanics. And it took them 7 years. They hated writing. One thing I've always been able to do was I've always been able to write, is what I always did as a kid. So, it's bizarre that I met two great theoretical physicists, and the one thing they couldn't do, I could actually do. So whatever it is you do in your career, you will find something quite by accident that you're good at. There's the evidence. There's me, a thinner, younger man, standing between the two of them. That's Feynman's son, Carl. When I used to go out to Pasadena, particularly in those days, they had a friend called Zorthian, Jereya Zorthian, small little Armenian guy who introduced Feynman to the world of art, and they had these absolutely fantastically wild parties. And I used to love going there, mainly because you never knew who might turn up. And here's a photo I took. There's Zorthian, and that's Burgess Meredith, who played the trainer in the Rocky films, and he played the Riddler or the Joker in the Camp 60s Batman series. So I've never taken any sort of grade A narcotics because I haven't needed to. My problems of trying to discern reality from psychedelia stemmed from actually going to California when I was 17 because of all this great stuff that I was exposed to. And if you get the chance to do those sorts of things, do. Al's claim to fame when he was a student was him and his roommate, Roy Walford. They decided to go to Vegas and to Reno to work out the errors in roulette wheels and to use that to make a shed load of money, which they did. If any of you have seen the thing on Netflix about the biosphere in the Arizona desert, Roy was one of the astronauts, or whatever you want to call them, inside that. He was a world expert on longevity. They went to these different places. They made the press. They worked out what the errors were in each roulette wheel, because every roulette wheel is a mechanical system. Certain numbers are going to come up more often than others. And in this case, the tricky bit is working out how you put your money into the various bits. And they made a load of money. And that was Al's entry to JPL. They believed his statistics and they believed his analysis. So he became the first sort of systems analyst, was the kind of chief mathematician on what became America's first satellite. Now, in those days, JPL was run by the US Army before NASA, and the other US Army facility was the one set up in Huntsville with Werner von Braun. And in 1956, they launched this, because there's a US Army. You'll see a version of this that you're probably more familiar with. On the top of this was a thing they called the re-entry test vehicle. And basically, it was a ballistic cone that would go into the edge of space, flip over, come back. And somebody suggested, why don't we have a mission failure and it go into orbit? And if they'd have done that, the US Army would have got this test vehicle into orbit at least a year before Sputnik. What did happen was that the RTV, the re-entry test vehicle, the story leaked. RTV and a local newspaper picked it up, thought it stood for Rocket to Venus, and there was an almighty row, and that was partly why the US Army was banished from launching the first American satellite. Here's Al with the first American satellite. There's Explorer 1. There he is next to the model of it, and it would launch into orbit surrounded by 11 solid rocket motors as it spun. And his calculations of the probability of whether it would work or not were the only thing that they had. So it was launched, and there's the famous picture. There's Bill Pickering and Van Allen, who were the JPL director, and his friend who put the Geiger counter in that. There's von Braun. There's the famous Explorer 1 satellite with the thing at the top. But what you don't see in that photograph, the other side of the room, is the guy who, Al was in California. He did the calculation, was it in orbit or not? He phoned through, said, yeah, it's in orbit, it'll appear. Guy went like that, and they held up that, and 8 minutes later, the satellite was in orbit. So there was quite a lot at stake. So if you know your statistics and you know your maths, you're onto a good thing. Typical JPL, there was a party afterwards after they'd finished. Now, as well as the messing about, the point to make with this is that these guys knew what they were doing. So there is a report, 1959, when JPL was taken over by NASA. It was the exploration of the moon, the planets, and interplanetary space. And it's basically the blueprint of how you would do this. And NASA sort of went, oh, okay, right, we're not really thinking about that. Why I think this report is really interesting is because they have a whole chapter on public reaction. Catch a falling Sputnik, put it in a matchbox, and send it back to the USA. Al knew from the very beginning that public reaction, how you present this to the public, is an important thing in what you do with space. And this is just a random paragraph. The public interest in full colour photographs taken by a remote camera on the surface of Mars will be little as compared to the wild reception which will greet the first crew of astronauts which returns alive from that planet. So there we are, I'll send that to Elon Musk. Al then set up the Space Science Division at JPL, and there's some high-tech instruments that they were going to fire at the moon, most of which failed. The Ranger series, here's a Ranger with this balsa wood ball. It was because the launchers failed. At least 4 of them failed because of that. What's fantastic about this is that the Rangers would smash into the moon and take lots of photos. And just before it was going to do that, this balsa wood ball would be ejected, inside of which was a seismometer. But it had to be descoped because they needed to put more electronics on to get these instruments to work. The problem was, and again, for all of you who go into the space industry, there are times when space stuff works and there are other times when it doesn't. And when it doesn't, just make sure that you let the public know what you're doing. Don't hide behind a wall and pretend that everything's fine. Let the people know what they're doing, because that's what JPL did in the early days. They'd been heroes. They'd launched the first satellite. After that, they'd had 6 straight failures with the Rangers, and they never snowed to the public. They always said, this is what we're doing. And Al was the forefront of that. He ended up having his own TV show, and I still meet people who are older than me who were teenagers in the 60s who remember, because he had this ability to explain things. And I've always thought that the gods don't bestow on most of us those skills. You can either be very clever and know what you're doing, or you can explain stuff, but the two is very difficult to match. He was one of those lucky people who did that. He became the lab spokesman and was showing around the politicians, and got very good at it. Whenever they wanted anybody to talk about stuff, they did. And again, it might be something that you do probably as a sideline, but do it, because if you can do it and you can explain stuff, it's great. So after I left college in '85, I then spent a couple of years, sort of gadding around, and eventually got hired as a researcher on this book with ITN. And here's my other great story for this, is the fact that I then got to meet another great person from a totally different background who was very important to me. His name's Frank Miles, and here he is. He left school when he was 14. He was science editor at ITN. Behind the scenes, you never saw him on the camera. And he knew everything about space. Some of you might not know, but in 1986, there should have been a British astronaut to go up on the shuttle to launch a military payload called Skynet. Not the one in the Terminator films. This was just a military communications satellite. And this guy, Peter Longhurst, Commander Peter Longhurst, I always thought if he was in a Bond film, he'd have shared an office with Commander James Bond, because he's a great guy. And one of his bosses said, "Okay, you're going to launch. We've got the chance to launch a satellite. I need a job description for an astronaut." So he did what I would do, and what I suggest you do is he based the job description for the astronaut on his own career. And but then the military got involved, and there had to be an Air Force officer, and there had to be, and all this. And in the end, he didn't get chosen. Our first astronaut would have been called Nigel, that's another story. Frank had absolute attention to detail. He went to the editor in 1969 and said, "I want to cover the moon landing." The editor said, "Oh, thank God for that, there's somebody." And he steeped himself in the utter knowledge of doing this. And again, that's a transferable skill for all of you who are doing physics. You have the ability to absorb lots of abstruse information. I mean, here's high tech in 1969. That's what the command module pilot would do with these high. He learnt this back to front. And what he did, what he actually then, alerted to NASA there were a couple of inconsistencies with this. That attention to detail, that drilling down, is something that if you're doing science, is something that you can use in other areas. What they did was when the first landing took place, and there was all the stuff last summer with the BBC about what a great coverage we did. What the BBC never pointed out was ITN had 3 times the audience, mainly because of one of Frank's bright ideas. So the astronauts are coming down, and the audience always wanted to hear what the astronauts said. Makes sense. The problem is the astronauts are talking in jargon. So what Frank did realize was if he could understand the flight plan and what was supposed to happen, he could sit with a kind of very, very early version of Twitter, if you like, which was a character generating machine. Now, again, today, when, if you go to an airport and you see those flipboards, that was what was in use then, but then there were the first character generators. So there's Frank with Hilary Deed, who was the PA, how far we'd come. And they programmed this thing so that as the astronauts were coming down and they were talking, and at the moment that Buzz Aldrin said contact light, he typed in touchdown. And even before Armstrong had said the Eagle has landed, they typed in the Eagle has landed. That is the mark of good journalism and understanding your subject. And I hope when there's the first landing on Mars, it will be one of you and that somebody else will be the expert in the studio providing the commentary. The other thing I got from Frank is something which isn't really highly rated in academia, but is useful in journalism, is utter fearlessness. This was ITN. So the first moon landing was Apollo 11. The next one was Apollo 12. And as some of you know, Al Bean accidentally pointed the camera at the sun. So they were waiting for TV pictures. There's Peter Fairley, who was the science correspondent on air, and Her Majesty came to see. And he was explaining, well, what had happened is he'd accidentally pointed the camera at the sun, so there's no TV pictures. And Her Majesty said, "How careless." And Frank wanted to run the bulletin with that. Now, there is a convention in journalism that you don't doorstep or quote the Queen. I mean, if you saw the Queen today, the first question you'd say is, "You really hate her, don't you?" But anyway, I stand corrected. The point is with this, that he wanted to run the bulletin with that, and that he was overruled, but he was utterly fearless. He knew all the astronauts. I mean, here's a picture you probably hadn't seen, again from Apollo 12, Dick Gordon, who was the command module pilot, came to London, and there's Peter Fairley, Diana Edwards-Jones. They dressed him as an English gent and followed him around the city for a day. They got to know the astronauts because their coverage was so much better than anybody else's. There's a photograph to show you that one other thing, that particularly in the space business, there's always going to be bullshit, there's always going to be hype. And anybody who can point out that the emperor is wearing no clothes will, get to the heart of a problem. So the book that Frank and I were working on about going to Mars, we went to Boulder, Colorado, 1987. If you get the chance to go to Boulder, do. It's a great city. And the keynote speaker was Carl Sagan. Now, this was a photo I took years before. And Carl stood up and said billions and whatever he said and whatever. And it's the only time I've ever seen anybody be enraged. And Frank was sitting next to me and interrupted and basically said, "You're just talking nonsense." And 300 people stared at us because you don't interrupt the Queen and you don't say that to Carl Sagan. But you need that in journalism, particularly with the space industry, when people trade on their name and sort of talk nonsense, which a lot of people do, myself included, unfortunately. What people forget about Cosmos was that there were lots of problems with it. And one thing that happened with Sagan, which again, for all of you, when you become famous academics or whatever you do, don't lose your sense of humour, because Sagan was so rarely at Cornell, the students put together this thing of, if anybody actually touched Carl Sagan, they'd run a story in it, and he would take too kindly to that. Yours truly then became a general reporter. My first job was on Astronomy Now. I then ended up working for newspapers. So here is French Guiana. If Twitter had been around, obviously I'd have tweeted that. There's a Ariane rocket. There's me as a thinner, younger man. And that was just a dreadful trip, because everything that went wrong went wrong. I ended up with giardia, which is a form of amoebic dysentery. And I came home and there was a little filler about what had happened. There's a lesson that you will learn the hard way in the space business. There's always going to be a bigger story. It doesn't matter if you think it's the biggest story in the world, something else will come along to spoil that. There's no solution to it. It's just in the nature of news, but it's something that you have to get used to. What I did was got a fantastic story about Tintin's rocket, La Fusée de Tintin, because in the French system, they still do national service. So you guys would probably be doing a technical degree and spend a couple of years in French Guiana building stuff. And these French students decided to build La Fusée de Tintin, which was there, thing that Tintin landed on the moon with. I mean, it's a complete disaster as an aerodynamic shape, but they built it and it worked. I just thought that was a fantastic story. In those days, a science page was like this. So there was my story about Tintin, some about an iceberg, marine life, modern ills, all this. So it's a sort of, it's like a tapas meal for an incredibly fussy eater. That's what you're doing in journalism, basically. You're trying to have variety to get people interested. In anything that you do, you have to know your audience. And this is the serious bit when I'm going to talk about what I learned. Again, these are things that you need to understand if when you go out and you're trying to explain what you're doing to a general audience. I don't follow football anymore. I mean, I like this because it's a three-body problem. It shows it quite graphically. I know who Ronaldo is, or was. I know that if I read in the newspaper, the centre forward was offside and there was a free kick and there was a penalty and blah, blah, blah. When you're writing about, I know, I understand what that means. I can't really explain it, but I know roughly what it means. When you're writing about science for a general audience, you've got to define what the stadium is. And that's one of the tougher things. If in the future, anything you do, the thing that you can bring to it is to bring context and explain what it is you're trying to do, because you're outside the stadium even before you begin. Here's an example. Most scientific and technical writing, you're writing a report, and it's really like a very long tube journey from, I don't know, Ealing to Gants Hill, and you stop at East Acton, and then you might go to Edgware Road, and you might stop off and do a bit of shopping in Bond Street and blah, blah, blah. And that's really what a scientific paper is. It's every step of what you're trying to do. In any form of storytelling or journalism, you go straight from Oxford Circus to Leighton. It's one stop. You've got to compress what you're doing. There is no room and no time to go through every little step. And it can be very frustrating. It's frustrating for myself, who was in newspapers, because every time you write a story on the same subject, you're like him, Sisyphus from Greek mythology, who the gods tormented by making him roll this rock up to the top of the hill. He did it and roll back time. Every time you write a story about DNA, you've got to say the same thing over and over again. And that, in a nutshell, was why I sort of stopped doing daily journalism, because I wanted to do other things. Again, one thing that you can bring to the party is, with your technical knowledge, you can help people avoid snafus. So I'd been on holiday in September '97, came back, and I'd already written the piece, and it was about the 100th anniversary of the electron. And J.J. Thomson discovered the electron. To my horror, when I got back, it was J.J. Thomson invented the electron. And I think, my God, thank God I came back from holiday that day. Because you've got your scientific background and you can use that, because not everybody else has that. Mistakes are made all the time. I saw this recently and thought, now, if that's true, that really is a good story. Twice the speed of light, that disappeared within an edition. People make mistakes. If you all you do is hold and stop other people from making mistakes, you're actually achieving something valuable, I think. One of the first missions I reported on was this one, Hipparcos, which was a big, long, involved acronym. There was me. I actually went to see it. A friend of mine, I showed that to a friend of mine. He said, I didn't realise you were training as a pastry chef. Friends. Um, Hipparcos was launched, it was supposed to be into a geosynchronous orbit, and it would spin, and it would take basically the first detailed astrometrical map, in other words, kind of population census of the stars. I did the piece. Robin, who edited the page, put scientists nervously await the one chance launch of a radically new. And I remember thinking at the time, come on, you're over egging the pudding. He was right and I was wrong because it was launched the following week. The kick stage didn't fire properly, so it went into the wrong orbit. And that's something that you can get within space is there's always drama and there's always excitement, particularly that moment when you light the firework and off it goes. I reported Hubble, what a great opportunity. I saw it go, April 1990, there it went. This was 2 weeks after there'd been a launch hold and there was a problem with the previous attempt. And 31 seconds before, that was a genuine, anonymous, somebody sent me that. I'd been talking to this Air Force meteorologist here, and there was a hold at 31 seconds. So I was mumbling and muttering, and somebody sent me that photograph, but off it went. And I was there, and there was a piece I did. And I remember at the time, I'm pinching myself, how lucky I am. People are paying me to do this. And that's, I hope you get some of that in the start of your careers. I pat myself on the back. I was one of the first people who realised that actually one of the instruments on Hubble was a bucket. So it didn't matter if the more light that you collected in the bucket, it would work. So I was one of the first to say, actually, even though they've launched it with the wrong shaped mirror slightly, we're going to do okay. People say to me, how many books have you written? And I say about 20. Well, this one took a weekend. It's a kid's book. I mean, I don't really count that. But I was learning how to do that. I did a book about space, the future, which was astonishingly accurate for about a year. And after that, everything falls apart because that's in the nature of what you do. I travelled looking when there was a new NASA administrator, as there is now. Here's a very salutary lesson for a lot of you. Here was the NASA administrator, James Fletcher, who'd been a classmate, by the way, of Al Hibbs at Caltech, who sold the shuttle to the Nixon administration using an absolutely ridiculous mathematical analysis that proved if you could launch 60 flights a year, you could make the shuttle work, economically. Somewhere there, reason therefore there's a flight rate crossover between the cost. The point of this is most people knew that was, to use a technical term, bullshit. They knew that they would never be able to do that. They never launched more than about 8 shuttles a year. And one person who diagnosed this was after the Challenger accident, our friend Feynman. And this was the appendage of his report, because he didn't pull any punches. And after Challenger blew up, because of the historical problems of trying to get this thing to work that nobody knew could ever work in the way it was intended, for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. After he died, the students unveiled this banner, "We love you, Dick." I miss him. I'm so pleased I got to meet him, and share a few stories with him. So yeah, I carried on, fixed Hubble. I was out at the Cape again. People paid me money to do that. There I am at the Cape. There's the shuttle. You don't get anywhere near there. Around this time, there was the first British astronaut, the Juno project, which was a very strange project. I often wonder, would it work now? Because the government wouldn't put any money into human spaceflight. So it was this commercial project to run a TV show and to get sponsorship, and it didn't work. And we were the first to say, hold on, something not quite right here. The perils of selling space to the masses. And that's something for a lot of you if you go into the space business, because there's a lot of startups, there's a lot of the new space paradigm and all this kind of stuff. And I don't believe half of it. I didn't believe about Juno then. One person I liked a great deal was this guy, Heinz Wolf, who was a professor at Brunel. Now, he was quite famous because he was on a kids' TV show called The Great Egg Race. There he is. It was a sort of nutty professor type. He was German. So he sounded like a nutty professor, because that's how science was done on the television in those days, ridiculous as it may seem. The most entertaining evening I've ever spent was when him and his wife told us the story about the day he woke up to read his own obituary, which is a fantastic story. I could tell you the whole thing. The Sun reported that a Professor Heinz Wolf had died, but it was another Professor Heinz Wolf in Germany and not him. And what made me laugh out loud about that was that they told us this, and it was like people were phoning, but no, everybody did that English thing. They didn't say, "We've just read he's dead." They'd say, "Oh, how's Heinz? Is he all right?" Um, he had a great sense of humour, by the way, and he only got involved with that because there was no funding. So be very, very careful, because as I said in that piece, in the final analysis, perhaps the moral of the meteoric rise and ignominious fall of Project Juno is those who live by the hype die by the hype. It's the same now with any project. Be very careful that, if something is overhyped, if you know that it's hyped and you don't get involved with it, that's not such a bad thing to do. On the final few minutes, I'm running slightly over late, is one place where there's never been any hype, and if you get the chance to go to Baikonur, you should. It's one of the most bizarre, surreal trips I've ever been on. This was 1994. We flew down on a Russian military jet. We got on the plane, and there was no, "We're taking off now." It just took off. So that, we better sit down. Um, I made pals with the general. Always make pals with the general, because he was in charge of the rocket forces. And we'd say, "Oh, can we go on that?" "No, oh, okay, if you want to." Um, the nearest city is Leninsk, and I only show that is because this was 3 years after, this 94, 3 years after the end of the Soviet Union. They obviously hadn't gotten the memo, because Lenin was still there. I thought that was quite symptomatic of what that place was like. There am I standing with a very strange pair of trousers, but that's neither here nor there, on this launch site that had been abandoned. And this was actually the launch site for the Soviet moon rockets, the M1, and that was a genuine photograph when they had a test model and one they were going to launch. And famously, 3 weeks before Apollo 11, one took off and exploded on the pad, and all that was left was the tubing and the piping where I was stood. You wouldn't get a camel at Cape Canaveral. Look at the state of the road where the bus pulled over and we went and talked to the camel. It felt like a surreal place to be. You're always taken to that. That's where Gagarin, Yuri himself, spent the night before his first flight. You look in and it's exactly as he left it. Unlike Cape Canaveral, you can walk all over the launch pad, and we did the night before. And there was the launch. Again, there was very strange, no countdown. You just saw this launch and off it went. One room was full of these nose cones, and I was just intrigued by this, because this was the Energia booster that they never flew. And it was almost like, if you had enough money, you could buy one of those. The Soviets had a shuttle called Buran, which was robotic, unmanned, or whatever you want to call it, and it went around the Earth 3 times and landed. And in another building, we found a test model, and it looked for all the world like people had nicked all the wheels off it. And about 10, 15 years ago, this building collapsed and killed some people, because they just literally ran out of money. But the thing that really struck me about them was this press trip, and there's high-tech computers in 1994, and the babushka was selling drinks, and in the next room, the cosmonauts were all suiting up, and she had an abacus. I never forgot that. So yours truly travelled as Karuna, and I missed attempt to grow a beard, to do a book about the ozone layer. This was the Esrange facility. Some of you might remember that word, because it's the Swedish word for balloon launching field. It's a good one for Scrabble, because I went out there and there's a balloon being launched, and remarkably impressive. If you get the chance to do that, even to go to Karuna, you should. And it gave me a great intro for the book I did. It was Friday the 13th, and it showed on the faces, blah, blah, blah. Because again, he's trying to put some drama to something. Now, here's another thing. If you spend all your time writing the greatest works in Shakespeare, modest, it counts for nothing if the cover is crap. And that was the cover of that. As soon as I saw the cover of that book, I thought, it's not going to sell. And I was proved right. It sold for, I think it was 20 quid. They couldn't get rid of it at 4.95. And they couldn't even get rid of it at 1.99. So you're never going to make your fortune by writing about science. But if you want to, so here was a review of my book by Peter Talak. So I was freelance. He was working for Nature. He is now a leading literary agent. So when you come to write your bestseller in 10 years' time, look up The Science Factory and Peter Talak and tell him I said, so that I told you to contact him. During the times, there it was in the good old days of the old building. And basically, I just used any damned excuse I could to write about Mars, because that's what I was really interested in. July 1996, the story about that, some nonsense about computers. And it just so happened that a week later was the discovery of the Antarctic meteorite with the stuff in it that could have been life. And I just happened to have all these photos on my desk. And the news editor walked past and said, "You know about Mars? 20, 400 words on what it all means." And that really was the origins of the book that we've just done. I say, any excuse. Forecast for Mars, the Mars Observer. Unfortunately, it failed just before it arrived, but I kept all my notes, and whatever you do in future, keep everything. Gil Levin, who claims he discovered life on one of the Viking experiments, spoke to him at length. Because of Al, one of his good mates is Donna Shirley, who was the first female project manager at JPL. I got to know her quite well. So that was a piece I did. There's a whole chapter in our book about her. And she was responsible for Sojourner, which was the first rover. So when you think Perseverance is this big box with lots of wheels on it, that was like a microwave with wheels on it. I've been waiting all this time for a microphone, and finally, because the Polar Lander in '99 failed, but most recently, there's now a microphone, and there's weather instruments working on the surface of Mars. So you'll get there in the end. I also like to point out I was a 00 operative years before Daniel Craig, because as a technology editor on a newspaper, you get to talk to whoever you want. So I talked to Desmond Llewellyn, who played Q, with high tech. Here's a man with a very silly haircut, and there's me. Meeting Donald Trump. None of us had any idea then, by the way. I've no idea how I met him or why I did, but he just turned up, and there's the proof. So I left papers in '99. I've gone off. I did my book about spies. I've done one about a heist on the Bank of England, and I couldn't have done that if I'd not done science writing. I got to a stage where I just wanted to do something else. Here's another clue. Always make sure if you're going to go do something fancy, get somebody else to pay. So I did a author's tour of Florida, and this just illustrates something else. That's the last time I wore a tie, I think. I was in this swanky hotel in Palm Beach, and I didn't know there was a shuttle launch, STS 119, and off it went. And I was watching it on the news and saw all these people go outside, and I just missed what would have been the greatest photo. There's the shuttle that had gone, and it was a night just on the edge of a sunset, so it would have been a great photo. The reason I'm saying that is people only ever read the headlines. So when I was staying in this hotel, this magazine or newspaper, and I got some very funny looks because people thought I was a double agent who was rogue and brave, but it's not, it's the headline. Headlines are great because they're always written by somebody else, and you always need to stand back. I mean, this is a great headline: breathing oxygen linked to staying alive. You don't say. This one was a genuine one, which I saw, which I thought was really funny. Woman fighting, it's what they call in news a slow news day. I love this one. Report shows that some of us are setting fire to things, drinking too much and can't afford a home. That was written by the wife of an astronomer at Joggle Bank. It's in my local paper here. The last few stories I did, it was the 30th anniversary of Apollo 11. So I interviewed Charlie Duke, and I went out on a high note because he was Capcom when Apollo 11 landed. I was 35 that summer. Yeah, I'll take that as my swan song. I hope you get to meet lots of astronauts and get lots of mementos like that. The last piece I ever did was about setting a base on the moon. Here we are, nearly 25 years later. This might happen one day. I realised that I'd had all these notes about Mars, and there was a book I was going to do and never quite finished, and it's taken me another 20 years, then with another author. Because one thing that you guys will have, as I say, for the next 10 years, you'll have great fun, and you'll have lots and lots of energy. Elizabeth is a fantastic writer, reporter. She's working for a lot of different agencies, and she can churn it out by the yard. So it was great to collaborate with her on the book because she's up to date, and I know all the ancient history because I reported on it, and she's reporting on it now. She's also been to Mars. She's been to a Mars base, and I was very jealous and didn't speak to her for at least a week. That's what one again. If you can get to do that, you should. And finally, because Mars was in the sky, we thought it would be wise to offer to the great god of war our book, and obviously it didn't work very well. But there we are. So that's what I've done, and I'm sorry I'm slightly over than I wanted to be. What I wanted to say is to recap of what I've said. It doesn't matter who you are, what you're good at, you will find something, you'll find a niche, and good luck, because I had a great time and I didn't end up doing research because I wasn't good enough and I ended up doing other things. I hope you will find something that you'll enjoy, and I suspect that the world will hear a lot more from all of you in the future. So Thank you.
So thank you very much for your presentation. We found it really interesting and also very funny.
Thank you.
So now our hosts also have a couple questions. So I'll go first. So
Okay.
you talked about your book, Space, the Next 100 Years. And I just wanted to ask, like, what were the expectations and how does it compare to the space industry now?
The difference then was that the book came out in the end of 1990, and the space station, the American ISS, had been going through so many different iterations and nearly was cancelled, and all these things were going on. So it was very difficult to get a clear view of what would happen. But you knew there would be a space station. And here we are 30 years later, and there is a space station, and it's launched, and it's done all these great things. So you always knew there was going to be a space station, and it was the important question was when. And in those days, it was, you didn't have a clear view. You also knew, because Europe had got its own little space plane project to do that Britain wasn't part of, because we were in bad odour with the European Space Agency, and that was cancelled. So there's always, the problem is with anything trying to predict the future is people can come up with great ideas that, and you will work on these things, and you'll spend 5 or 6 years, bottoming it out, presenting it to the politicians, and then there's a change in government, and it's cancelled. So the hardest thing is to predict the political reality of what's going to happen. So most of the far future stuff, so there was a project, an idea of a light sail that you would send to halfway to Alpha Centauri. That might still go ahead, but I have no idea when that's going to happen. There was a discussion about antimatter propulsion. Might be fantastic, get to Mars next week, sort of thing. But again, that's not funded, and I don't know if anybody will ever be able to do that. So from the perspective of where we are now, America will return to the moon. We don't know when. There will be Canadian astronauts involved. Britain will be involved peripherally. Beyond that, what happens to the space station? Will there be the lunar gateway? Will there be this? I don't think anybody knows, because it depends on the politics and what the taxpayer is willing to fund. Mars sample return will happen. Will it all happen in one go? Maybe, maybe not, but there's the willpower to do that. So predicting the far future with the commercialization, I think the only place that you can look is in the past. So when Magellan went around the Earth in 1520, it was another 40 years before Drake did. And then after that, the sort of first American colonies. Now I realise I'm on dangerous ground with a lot of people who are trying to decolonize things, but the only place we can look is history. And the point is with that it's the same time scale. So here we are 50 years after the first moon landing. People are talking about going back to the moon, and there are talks of doing it commercially. Now, again, will that be done by governments, or will it be done by individuals? I honestly don't know. I don't know if there's enough political willpower to do it by governments, and I'm wondering how people will fund projects commercially to do this, because I really do not believe there's an asteroid that will be towed back to Earth and broken down. I don't think that's going to be possible for many, many centuries. So the near future, looking back from history, if we can avoid the tub thumping and the flag beating and all that sort of stuff, I think that we will go back to the moon. People will establish bases. Will there be commercially ones done? Eventually in time, but I don't know anybody. I don't think anybody knows what the timescales will be. For you guys, it's great, because you might be involved in that. You might end up going down blind alleys and not being involved in it. But I think if there's a sort of combination of government willpower and entrepreneurs who will put the money in, something will come out of it. But I don't think anybody knows when that is.
Okay, so I would like to ask a question now. So obviously you've written a lot of books about Mars, and we can see your enthusiasm about Mars and life on Mars. But a few months back, there was talk about life on Venus. How did this news, which was later debunked, affect your books or views and general view of life in the solar system?
The savage irony was, it was the same day that the book turned up, because it's an American publisher, by the way. So my first reaction was, we spent 2 years and we picked the wrong planet. Damn. I was really impressed by what they did actually, because they said, here is what we've discovered, and here's how we've analysed this data, and here's all the basic data, and here are our methods. Off you go and have a look. And it's been since then has been kind of pulled apart. The same happened when I was reporting with the Mars meteorite in 1996. There was lots of kind of circumstantial bits that, if you put them together, implied there might have been life, and that took kind of 20 years to pull apart. And there's still one or two people who are saying we still think there's life there. Other people, because what happens is with these stories are that they become so arcane and so involved that unless you're the world expert on, you know, kind of phosphine isotopes, you don't know. So you've got so what will happen with the Venus stuff is what happened with Mars. There'll be, you know, scientific meetings, and all the phosphine isotope experts will yammer it out together. The key, I think, from the point of view of the general public, was there aren't any Venusians, you know, people with silly hats and, you know, sort of antennae and things like that. And that's one of the problems when you talk about life in space, is we know Mars is, you know, desiccated, desolate, freezing. There's not much going on. So if anything is discovered, it by definition is going to be fairly arcane and not immediately understandable by a lot of people. Now, again, you're at King's, so you know all about DNA, so you know about chirality, and you can understand if a chiral molecule is found in a derivation agent on a, well, you understand what that means. Most people don't. So this is one of the things that I think, if there is life in space, it's going to be so fairly arcane and complicated, it won't be what people, you know, what they'd like it to be, which is basically aliens talking to us, which, you know, I don't think is ever going to happen. Might be wrong, but there we go. But in terms of the Venus story, it was interesting because they were completely open and completely honest. And since then, it's been not pulled apart, but it's just it was something to do with the 12th harmonic of a wave and how you analyze that, and whatever. And again, it's the people who can analyze the 12th harmonic wave of a spectral signature are the experts on that. So you know you have to listen to what they're saying, basically.
Right. So one thing that we've spoken a lot about, which is like the role that private investments and like entrepreneurship has played in what is now becoming a new kind of space race. So what is your take on it? Like, how does something like that help, or like kind of, because it's been a topic of debate for a long time, and a lot of people are on like both sides of the spectrum. So some people feel that it's not good for space, etc. So how do you feel that helps or takes away from the whole notion of space exploration?
I'm fairly agnostic about a lot of it, to be perfectly honest, because I don't follow it with sufficient vim and vigour to feel that I can pontificate about it. So there's a first, a journalist who doesn't feel that he can pontificate. Well, there we go. I think there will be this balance between what entrepreneurs can reasonably do and what governments will reasonably do. And I actually think the interesting stuff is not so much the funding, but of the kind of philosophical implication. When we finished the book, originally we thought there would be a final chapter that we were going to call Cheery Fellows That We Are, Death on Mars, not Life on Mars. Because I do think what will be really interesting from the point of view of the general public is if somebody dies in space. I mean, there've been deaths in space and people have died, but it's not been in full technicolor. You know, you've not been sitting at home watching it happen as it unveils. Because I do think that when there's a death in space, people will then think, okay, this is something very different to what we've expected. And I think that will be a difference between a private enterprise and a government enterprise. If a government enterprise, you know, if somebody's killed in space on a government-funded mission, there will be congressional or, you know, House of Commons and different inquiries into that. Whether you have to go to do that with private individuals is a different matter. So I think that to me is the interesting question. I'm not a moral philosopher, but it's the fact that what happens when somebody dies in space. If it's a government program, I think, you know, it'll be stopped in its tracks. Private individuals, I think, will, you know, carry on biting the cigar and keep going and keep doing it, but figuratively speaking. But it's a fundamental question that I don't think anybody knows the answer to, and that to me is interesting. So there'll be enough people who will put money into it. Whether they will get a return on investment, that's a very different question, and I don't think anybody knows that. So it'll be this kind of balance between the two, and it will come out of left field. Something will happen that nobody can predict, and that will be, you know, it could be a new transportation system to get you from here to the asteroid belt, or it could be something else on, so that you can mine on the moon. I don't know what that'll be. That could be you guys. It could be you guys who does that, and that's the great thing, because you never know in the future what you will find. And that's why I don't make predictions generally, because I don't think anybody can with realistically. So I think there will be deaths in space, and how will society as a whole react to that? Will entrepreneurs have enough money to keep on throwing money at it to do the stuff that they want to do? And will the general public just avert its gaze? Because that's one of the hardest things with space. People always thought space stations, waltzing to the Blue Danube, all that kind of stuff that we grew up with. But not everybody feels the same. And it's really, the big question is, what will the rest of all the non-space specialists think about all this? And nobody can predict that.
That's actually a very interesting thing.
Yeah.
Also,
Notice
speaking of,
it was a politician's answer. Yes, there'll be somebody here next week who can answer that question. Yeah. No, I honestly don't know what the answer is. If I knew, I'd tell you. It's in my back pocket. I'd show it to you.
yeah. Also, speaking of the transportation system, what do you feel like? What kind of a role does the moon play in not just getting to Mars, but also future missions in space?
The moon and Mars question is the kind of fundamental question that's been there forever. The day that Armstrong and Aldrin and Collins went to the moon, the American Vice President Spiro Agnew stood up and said, "Our next mission in space will be to send humans to Mars." That was in 1969. And nobody's ever, do you go to the moon, which is next door, which is easy relatively to get to, although the places they want to land, Shackleton Crater and all those sort of South Polar places, aren't going to be easy to do? Or do you say, okay, let's just go to Mars? I don't know what the answer is to that, but I do think the order of stuff that you need to be able to do to get to Mars and to come back and to survive that journey. Now we know robots can do it because we're on the 10th successful landing. Will the human frame last that long? I don't know, and this was why I said about the question about death, because somebody or a crew might get caught in a solar flare en route to Mars, and by the time they get back, that's it. The number is up. But as to the question, the moon first or Mars, I think it will be a strange combination of both. The problem is the moon isn't, I'll probably get booed and hissed for saying this, isn't inherently that interesting. I mean, compared to Mars, it isn't, in my humble view. And will people want to say, okay, we're just going to go to Mars and establish, some sort of base? But the ability to be able to do that, I think Elon Musk is, how should we put this, a little ambitious to say it can be done in 5 years. I don't think it will be. I think it's going to be quite a number of years before the technology to be able to do that and to bring people back will be available.
You've written so many books about this, especially like life in the solar system, which is very exciting. So I was watching this Netflix thing, which is called Europa Mission or Mission Europa, one of those. And I was thinking, why not ever think of life on those planets? Because unlike moon, which we kind of assume is lifeless because of all the experiments we've conducted in like moon soil, Europa and I think Io as well, people actually assume there could be life because they have water and ice and enough heat because of the rotation around the
and particularly in Enceladus, the moon of Saturn, which again I didn't say because I've been trying to find the photo. I was actually there in the room when the first pictures of the detailed pictures of Enceladus came back, and it was 2006 when the plumes were discovered at Imperial by Michel Doherty and the group there, and that is interesting because there's organic. They already know there are organics within those plumes. So again, that's interesting from a scientific point of view. But how do you get to Enceladus? I don't really watch much science fiction, but what always makes me laugh is you see a sci-fi series and there's a base on a planet and they've got a drill and they drill 2 miles down. Over the last 18 months, InSight's landed, and the one place on Mars where its mole won't work is where it's landed. And every time it's gone in 3 inches, it's popped back up again. So I think the idea of this kind of brute force engineering to do all this stuff to find the stuff that you might want to do, again, it will be possible one day, but I think, it's going to be quite some time before you take that kind of idea into a test model, into an engineering proof, and actually then physically do it. It might take a few more times. But in terms of the solar system, yes to Europa, definitely for Enceladus, and keep on looking at the kind of interstellar grains and what you might find there. And the other area that, again, I know nothing about because I've not covered it, but I'm absolutely stunned by exoplanets. The ability to be able to see exactly what's happening, and these kind of light dips in the blink of an eye. TRAPPIST-1 sounds quite interesting. I don't know if it's going to be important or not, but it does look quite interesting.
All right, so that's it from us. Thank you so much for your time, sir. It's been an absolute pleasure, and as much as we learn, we hope that the people who view the podcast will as well. And
what I would like
once
to say what I would like to say to end is, I look back at the kind of remnants of what I sort of half did, but the exciting stuff is the next 10 years, and that's the next 10 years for all you guys and anybody watching this. We say in the book, one final plug, if anybody reading this will go to Mars, so I'm going to read the great words that what we wrote, because I'm old, I can't even remember where I live, let alone what I wrote 10 years ago. From both of us, it's our dearest hope that somebody who reads this book will actually make the journey to Mars. We'll be with you every step of the way. And don't forget to write. Keep on writing, keep a diary, whatever you do, keep hold of everything that you do, because one day, when you're old and grey, and like me, I can't remember, on a good day I can remember where I live, but you'll have forgotten all the excitement, all the blindness of the things, and that's what, when I look now to see expectant faces of students doing stuff, I think it's fantastic, and hopefully you'll do the stuff that I thought I wanted to do.
Right. So thank you so much, and hopefully once the pandemic settles, we can have you on campus with us as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love, any excuse really, to be in the King's Bar again.